5 days after giving birth, I carried my newborn to our front porch, expecting nothing more than a hot shower and my own bed. Instead, strangers were unloading moving boxes into my living room. One of them looked at me with genuine sympathy and quietly said, "Ma'am, we closed on this house 3 days ago." For a second, I honestly thought they had the wrong address. I looked down at the little pink blanket wrapped around my daughter Lily, then back at the white colonial house in Fishers, Indiana. The flower pots I'd planted every spring were still sitting beside the porch steps. The wind chimes my mother gave me 20 years ago still hung from the front porch. Everything looked like home. Except it wasn't. "I think you've made a mistake," I said, adjusting Lily against my shoulder. "My husband lives here." The older woman standing beside the moving truck lowered her eyes. "We bought it from Ethan Whitmore." My knees almost gave out. I reached for the doorknob. The key wouldn't fit. A brand new deadbolt, one I'd never seen before. A man in his 60s, probably the buyer, walked over carrying a folder. "I'm really sorry," he said. "The title company told us everything was finalized." He handed me a copy of the closing statement. There it was, our address, Ethan's signature, and what looked disturbingly like mine. Only, I had never signed it, not ever. My hands started shaking so badly I nearly dropped the papers. Lily stirred in her blanket and made a tiny, sleepy sound that somehow pulled me back to reality. I couldn't fall apart, not while I was holding her, not yet. I called Ethan straight to voicemail, again, disconnected. I texted, nothing. I opened our banking app. The password had been changed. I tried our joint credit card. Declined. I checked the account where we'd spent 12 years saving for retirement. Empty. Standing there on that front porch, still sore from an emergency C-section, I realized something that took weeks to fully understand. None of this had happened while I was in the hospital. It had only ended while I was there. The planning had started months before. Looking back, that's the part that still hurts more than anything else. During my pregnancy, Ethan had been wonderful. At least that's what everyone believed. He never missed an appointment. He held my hand during every ultrasound. He rubbed lotion on my swollen feet every evening while we watched reruns of Blue Bloods. When my back ached at 3 a.m, he'd get up without complaining and make me chamomile tea. He built Lily's crib himself, painted the nursery a soft sage green because I couldn't decide between that and pale yellow. Our friends called him Husband of the Year. Sometimes I'd laugh and agree. Now I wonder how many of those evenings ended with him emailing a realtor after I'd gone to bed. How many times did he kiss my forehead before quietly transferring another chunk of our savings somewhere I couldn't see? How many signatures had he practiced before forging mine? Those answers would come later. That afternoon, all I knew was that I had nowhere to go. The buyers were kinder than they needed to be. The woman disappeared inside and came back carrying my old diaper bag. "I found this in the garage," she said softly. Inside were diapers, wipes, 2 baby bottles, and 1 tiny stuffed rabbit. Nothing else. Everything I'd owned was gone. Family photographs, my grandmother's quilt, my wedding album, even the rocking chair my father had built before he passed away. I thanked them because I didn't know what else to say. Then I sat in my car with Lily asleep in her car seat and cried so hard my incision started hurting. My mother answered on the second ring. "Claire?" The second she heard my voice, she knew. "Mama!" "What happened?" I don't have a house anymore." Silence. Then the quiet steadiness only mothers seem able to find. "Come home. I don't even know if I can afford the drive. We'll figure that out." "No, I will." There was another pause. "I know you will," she said. I drove to a jewelry store in Carmel. The owner was an older gentleman with silver hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. He examined my wedding ring for less than a minute. "I can offer $1,100. I nodded immediately. He looked surprised. "You don't want to think about it?" "If I think about it," I said, "I won't do it." He understood. People his age usually do. He counted the bills carefully. Before I left, he slid a small package of polishing cloths across the counter. "No charge." It was such a tiny kindness. I nearly cried again. Driving with a newborn after major surgery wasn't smart. My doctor had warned me against it. Bloomington was almost an hour away. I wasn't sure I could make it safely, so I decided to take the Greyhound instead. The next morning I parked my car in long-term parking near the Indianapolis bus terminal. Lily slept through most of it. Babies have a way of sleeping through disasters adults never forget. Inside the station, people hurried past each other carrying backpacks, coffee cups, and grocery bags. Nobody noticed the woman walking slowly because every step pulled against fresh stitches. Except one person. An elderly man stood near the ticket counter, searching every pocket of his old canvas jacket. "I had it right here," he kept saying. The clerk looked exhausted. "I'm sorry, sir. Without payment, I can't issue the ticket." "I understand." His voice was calm, just defeated. The people behind him sighed impatiently. Someone muttered, "Come on." The old man stepped aside. He looked embarrassed more than angry. I checked my wallet. $23. That was all I had left after buying my ticket. Enough for diapers once I got to my mother's house. Or enough to buy his. I stared at the money for what felt like forever. A voice inside my head practically shouted, "Claire, stop! Your baby comes first." Another voice answered, just as quietly, "What if that were Dad?" My father had been gone 8 years. If he'd ever been stranded somewhere, I hoped someone would have helped him. I walked to the counter. "I'll pay for his ticket." The clerk looked relieved. The old man turned toward me. "No," he said gently. "You have a baby." "I know. I can't let you do that. You didn't ask me to." He smiled. Not a big smile, just enough to soften the deep lines around his eyes. While the clerk printed the ticket, he looked down at Lily. "She's beautiful." "Thank you. What's her name?" "Lily. And yours?" "Claire." He held out his hand. His grip was warm, despite the cool air inside the station. "I won't forget your kindness." I smiled politely. People say things like that all the time. Most of us never meet again. The boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. I picked up Lily, adjusted the diaper bag, started walking toward the bus. Halfway there, I looked back. The old man was still standing where I'd left him. He raised one hand in a quiet wave beneath the station lights. I waved back. Then I climbed onto the bus, believing I'd just said goodbye to a stranger. I had no idea that simple moment would become the turning point of my entire life. By the time the Greyhound pulled into Bloomington, my whole body felt like it had been through another surgery. Lily slept almost the entire ride, waking only once to eat. I envied her. Babies don't know when their world has fallen apart. They only know whether they're warm, fed, and being held. I wished life stayed that simple. My mother, Linda, was waiting outside the station in her 12-year-old Subaru Forester. She spotted me before I saw her. The second she noticed the diaper bag hanging off one shoulder and the exhaustion written all over my face, she hurried toward me. She didn't ask a single question. She wrapped one arm around me as carefully as she could without bumping my incision. "Oh, sweetheart." That was all. No lecture. No, "I warned you." Just those 2 words. Sometimes that's enough to keep a person standing. Mom's little ranch house hadn't changed much since Dad passed away. The same wind spinner turned lazily in the backyard. The same faded blue recliner sat beside the living room window where Dad used to read the Sunday paper. Only now it was covered with folded baby blankets. She'd been preparing for Lily's first visit for weeks. Neither of us imagined it would become our new home. That first week blurred together. Feed Lily, change diapers, take pain medication, try not to cry where Mom could see me, sleep for 45 minutes, repeat. One afternoon, I caught Mom sitting at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. She was adding numbers with an old calculator. When she noticed me, she quietly turned the paper over. "What are you doing?" "Oh, nothing." I smiled weakly. "You've never been good at pretending." She sighed. I was figuring out how long my Social Security check could cover groceries for 3 people. That broke me more than losing the house. My mother had worked 38 years as an elementary school secretary. She deserved a peaceful retirement, Instead, at 69, she was wondering how to stretch canned soup and frozen vegetables because her daughter had nowhere else to go. "I'll go back to work." She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "You can barely climb the porch steps." "I'll figure something out." "You just had major surgery." "I know." "You have a newborn." "I know." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "For once in your life, Claire, let someone else carry you for a little while." I wanted to, I just didn't know how. A few days later, I met Susan Keller. Mom's church friend had recommended her. Susan's office overlooked Monument Circle in downtown Indianapolis. She looked exactly how you'd expect a lawyer with 40 years of experience to look. Gray bob, comfortable shoes, sharp eyes. She listened without interrupting while I explained everything. Then she opened a yellow legal pad. "I have good news and bad news." I laughed. "I don't suppose the good news comes first." "It does," she smiled. "I think your husband committed several felonies." I blinked. "And the bad news?" "Proving it won't be fast." She explained that whoever handled the closing had relied on documents appearing to carry my authorization. Some signatures looked suspicious. Others were probably copied electronically. "The sale itself may be difficult to undo," she said carefully. "The new owners appear to have purchased in good faith." "So they're victims too?" "I'm afraid so." I rubbed my forehead. "So Ethan gets away with it?" "No," she leaned forward. "But we have to prove intent, fraud, and where the money went." Then she asked a question that stayed with me. "Claire, during your pregnancy, did your husband ever ask you to sign stacks of paperwork?" I thought about it. Insurance forms, hospital admission packets, leave of absence documents, mortgage insurance updates, life insurance beneficiaries. There had been dozens, maybe hundreds. "I signed whatever he put in front of me," Susan nodded slowly. "I was hoping you wouldn't say that." The following week became a strange routine. Every morning I'd feed Lily. Mom would rock her while I gathered paperwork, tax returns, retirement statements, old mortgage documents, hospital records, anything Susan asked for. The deeper we dug, the worse it looked. Money hadn't disappeared overnight. It had been draining away for months. 5,000 here, 8,000 there. Always explained by Ethan as market adjustments, temporary investments, moving funds for better interest. I had believed every word, not because I was foolish, because he was my husband. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Susan called. "I found something." My heart raced. "What?" "The house wasn't listed after you went into labor." "It wasn't?" "It went on the market almost 3 months earlier." I stopped breathing. 3 months. That was when Ethan insisted I stop checking our finances because stress wasn't good for the baby. That was when he started bringing me breakfast in bed. That was when he began telling everyone, "My wife deserves to relax." I sat there staring through the kitchen window while rain rolled down the glass. None of it had been spontaneous. He hadn't snapped, he hadn't panicked, he'd planned every step while pretending to love me. That realization hurt far more than the affair. 2 weeks after I bought the old man's bus ticket, someone knocked on Mom's front door. She looked out the window. "Claire, there's an older gentleman asking for you." I opened the door. There he was. Same canvas jacket, same worn suitcase, same gentle smile. For a second, I couldn't place him. Then I noticed his eyes. "The bus station." He nodded. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all." He held out an envelope. "I came to repay what you spent." I laughed softly. "You drove all the way here for $23? "No," he smiled. "I came because my wife would have been very disappointed if I hadn't thanked you properly." His voice caught ever so slightly when he mentioned her. I stepped aside. "Would you like some coffee?" "I'd like that." Mom had already started a fresh pot. Within minutes, the three of us were sitting around her old oak kitchen table. Harold admired Lily sleeping in her portable bassinet. "She's beautiful." "Thank you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. A smiling woman with silver hair stood beside him on a lakeshore. My Margaret. "You were married a long time?" 52 years. "I'm sorry." "So am I." For a while, we simply talked. Nothing extraordinary. Gardening, Indiana winters, hospital cafeterias, the Cubs, life. He never mentioned money, neither did I. Then headlights swept across the kitchen window. One black Lincoln Navigator pulled into the driveway, another stopped behind it. Mom frowned. "Were you expecting company?" Harold quietly set down his coffee cup. "I suppose they finally found me." Before I could ask what he meant, 2 professionally dressed men stepped onto the porch. One of them hurried to the door the moment I opened it. Relief flooded his face. "There you are, Mr. Bennett." The room fell completely silent. The younger man looked embarrassed. "We've been trying to reach you for days. Your daughter is worried sick." Harold gave him an apologetic smile. "I imagine she is." The second man glanced toward me, then back at Harold. "The board meeting has already been postponed." Board meeting? I looked from one face to the other. Harold stood slowly. He turned toward me with an expression somewhere between gratitude and regret. "I'm afraid I haven't been entirely honest." "You said someone stole your wallet." "They did." "You said you were traveling alone." "I was." "So," he smiled gently, "I simply forgot to mention that my family owns Bennett Industrial." I stared at him. Everyone in Indiana knew that name. Factories, scholarships, hospitals, thousands of employees. The quiet old man sitting in my mother's kitchen wasn't just wealthy. He was one of the most respected businessmen in the entire state. He looked at me the same way he had at the bus station. Not proud, not embarrassed, just sincere. Then he said something I never expected. "I didn't come here to change your life with money." He paused. "I came to ask if you'll let me help you get your life back." I didn't answer Harold right away. Not because I wasn't grateful, because I was scared. I'd spent the last 2 weeks learning what it felt like to have the ground disappear beneath my feet. When something unbelievable landed in front of me, every instinct told me to question it. "I don't need charity," I finally said. Harold smiled, almost as if he'd expected that answer. "I wouldn't respect you if you did." He looked around my mother's modest kitchen before continuing. "My wife used to say that the hardest people to help are the ones who deserve it most." Mom chuckled softly. "Your wife sounds like she would have fit right in around here." Harold laughed for the first time since I'd met him. "Oh, Margaret would have loved this kitchen." That little moment broke the tension. Then Harold reached into his leather folder and slid a business card across the table. Not a check, not cash. Just a name. Richard Ames, Forensic Financial Consultant. "I'd like you to meet someone," Harold said. "You decide what happens after that." I looked at Mom. She gave the smallest nod. "Okay." 2 days later, I found myself sitting in a conference room overlooking downtown Indianapolis. Richard Ames looked more like a retired accountant than someone who unraveled financial crimes. Gray sport coat, reading glasses, coffee mug that read "World's Okayest Grandpa." He smiled warmly. "Claire, Mr. Bennett asked me to review your records. I don't want anyone doing anything illegal." He almost looked offended. "My dear, I've spent 40 years putting people in prison for illegal." That earned my first genuine laugh in weeks. For the next 3 hours, we spread documents across the conference table. Bank statements, mortgage paperwork, hospital admission forms, retirement records. Richard rarely spoke. He simply highlighted dates with a yellow marker. Finally, he leaned back. This wasn't impulsive. "I know." "No," he tapped the timeline. "I mean, this began nearly 9 months ago." 9? He nodded. "The first suspicious transfer happened 3 days after you announced the pregnancy online." The room suddenly felt smaller. I remembered that evening perfectly. We'd celebrated with barbecue from City Barbecue. I'd posted one ultrasound photo on Facebook. Ethan had toasted with sparkling cider because I couldn't drink wine. Apparently, that same week he'd opened a separate business account. Over the next month, more people quietly joined the investigation. A retired title attorney, a digital document specialist, Susan Keller. Nobody promised we'd win. That actually made me trust them more. Every meeting ended the same way. "We need another piece. We're close. Don't rush. It was frustrating. Some mornings I wanted to scream. Instead, I folded baby laundry, changed diapers, learned how to soothe Lily through colic while answering questions about wire transfers. Life became strangely divided between motherhood and legal paperwork. One afternoon, Richard called. "I need you downtown." His voice sounded unusually serious. When I arrived, he projected a timeline onto a large screen. Colored lines connected dozens of transactions. Red, blue, green. "So," he said quietly, "here's what your husband actually did. He'd slowly moved money into shell investment accounts, taken loans against assets I'd never known existed, hidden losses from previous clients, used our retirement savings to cover those losses, sold the house to keep creditors from finding equity." "The affair?" Richard looked almost annoyed. "Honestly, Claire, the mistress was probably the least expensive mistake he made." I stared at the screen. For months, I'd imagined Ethan destroying our marriage because he loved someone else. Now I realized something even uglier. He loved money more than either of us. Harold called every Sunday evening, never to ask about the lawsuit, never to discuss evidence, only to ask one question. "How's Lily?" Sometimes he'd make ridiculous faces over a video call. My daughter would giggle, he'd grin like he'd won the lottery. One Sunday, he proudly announced he'd learned how to install a car seat. His daughter apparently didn't trust him. "I installed it backward." I laughed. I was wondering why the baby looked so surprised. Even Mom laughed at that. Those little conversations reminded me that not every older man disappeared when life became inconvenient. Some stayed. By early October, we believed we had enough evidence to request an emergency court order freezing Ethan's remaining assets. Susan warned me not to celebrate. The judge may want more. I understand. I didn't, not really. I walked into the hearing convinced justice was finally arriving. 43 minutes later, we lost. The judge denied the emergency request. Not because he believed Ethan, because the evidence, while troubling, wasn't complete enough for that specific order. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Ethan. He smiled, actually smiled. "I've always believed the truth would come out," he told them. I stood 20 feet away, holding my lawyer's briefcase while photographers snapped pictures. To anyone watching, it probably looked like he'd won. The drive back to Bloomington was the longest hour of my life. Nobody spoke. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. Halfway home, I whispered, "What if this is it?" Susan kept her eyes on the road. "It isn't." "What if he gets away with everything?" She didn't answer, because she couldn't honestly promise otherwise. That night, after Mom had gone to bed and Lily was finally asleep, I sat alone on the back porch. October air carried the smell of fallen leaves. Harold quietly stepped outside, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "I guessed you wouldn't be sleeping." "I feel stupid." "You aren't." "I trusted him." "You loved him." "Same difference." "No." He handed me a mug. "Those are 2 very different things." For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, I said the words I'd been trying not to think. "Maybe I should stop." He looked genuinely confused. "Stop what?" "The lawsuit. The investigation. Everything. I'm tired." Harold nodded slowly. "I know." Then he said something so simple that I've never forgotten it. "Claire, if you quit because you're exhausted, he'll spend the rest of his life believing decent people always give up." I stared into my mug. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." He smiled. "I've buried the love of my life. I promise you, strength isn't something you wake up with. It's something you discover because quitting hurts even more." 3 evenings later, Susan called. "Can you come to my office first thing tomorrow?" "Did something happen?" "Yes." "Good or bad?" "I honestly don't know yet." The next morning, a woman was already sitting inside Susan's conference room. Perfect makeup, designer handbag, red eyes. I recognized her immediately from photographs. Vanessa, Ethan's girlfriend. She stood awkwardly. "I'm not here because I'm a good person." I appreciated the honesty. "I'm here because Ethan lied to me too." Nobody spoke. She slowly placed a flash drive on the table, then another, then a thick envelope. I thought he was divorced. He told me your marriage ended years ago. She swallowed hard. He also convinced me to invest nearly $400,000. Susan looked up sharply. What? Vanessa nodded. He stole that, too. Inside the envelope were printed emails, wire transfer confirmations, property contracts, voice recordings, even handwritten notes Ethan had made during meetings. Richard flipped through the first dozen pages, then the next dozen. His eyebrows kept climbing higher. Finally, he looked at Susan, then at me. A slow smile spread across his face. For the first time, he said quietly, I think we finally have everything. The courthouse in Hamilton County had never looked so intimidating. I'd worked in hospitals for more than 20 years. I could stay calm during emergency deliveries, comfort frightened families, and make life-or-death decisions without panicking. But walking through those courthouse doors that morning, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped Lily's diaper bag. She was 4 months old by then, happily chewing on the corner of a teething toy as if this were any other Tuesday. I envied her. Outside, television vans lined the curb. Most weren't there because of my divorce. They were there because word had spread that federal investigators had begun looking into several of Ethan's investment accounts. Apparently, once one thread started unraveling, a lot of people realized they'd been holding the same sweater. Susan leaned toward me before we entered the courtroom. One more thing. What? No matter what happens today, don't react to Ethan. I won't. I mean it. I know. He'll probably try. She was right. The moment Ethan walked in, he smiled. Not warmly, not sadly. The kind of smile someone wears when they're convinced they're still the smartest person in the room. He looked thinner than I remembered. His expensive navy suit had probably cost more than my first car. Vanessa arrived a few minutes later with her own attorney. She didn't even look at Ethan. He noticed. His smile faded just a little. That tiny crack gave me more confidence than I expected. The hearing lasted almost 6 hours. At first, it felt painfully ordinary. Legal arguments, procedural motions, questions about property records, dates, wire transfers, corporate filings. Then, Richard Ames took the stand. Watching him testify reminded me why Harold trusted him. He wasn't dramatic, he wasn't angry, he simply explained numbers, one chart at a time. This transfer occurred on January 14th. This account was opened without Mrs. Whitmore's knowledge. Funds moved through 3 separate entities before returning to Mr. Whitmore's control. Even the judge leaned forward. Richard never exaggerated, he didn't have to. Facts are persuasive when they're organized. Next came the title company manager. She admitted that Ethan had insisted on handling nearly all communication himself. He claimed I was recovering from pregnancy complications and didn't want to be disturbed. Did you ever personally speak with Mrs. Whitmore? Susan asked. No. Did you ever verify her identity? We relied on notarized documents. Were those documents later determined to contain forged signatures? Yes. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. The manager looked genuinely embarrassed. I wish we'd caught it. I believe you do, Susan replied. No grandstanding, just truth. By lunchtime, Ethan looked uncomfortable for the first time, not frightened. Just irritated, as though the day wasn't going according to schedule. Then, Detective Mark Ellison testified. He explained that his financial crimes unit had begun reviewing multiple complaints involving Ethan's investment practice, former clients, retirement funds, misrepresented accounts. The judge raised an eyebrow. This investigation is ongoing? Yes, Your Honor. Independent of today's proceedings? Correct. Ethan whispered something urgently to his attorney. His attorney didn't whisper back. After a short recess, Susan called Vanessa. She walked slowly to the witness stand. For a brief second, I almost felt sorry for her. She looked exhausted. The polished confidence I'd seen in old social media photos was gone. She answered every question directly. Did Mr. Whitmore tell you he was divorced? Yes. Did you believe him? I did. Why? He showed me paperwork. Susan held up one document. Was this the paperwork? Yes. Richard later confirmed it had been fabricated. Vanessa took a slow breath. I wasn't having an affair with a married man. She glanced toward me for the first time. I was being lied to. The room stayed silent. She continued. He convinced me to invest almost $400,000 into what he called a private opportunity. Did you ever receive those funds back? No. When did you realize something was wrong? The day I learned Claire still thought she was happily married. You could almost hear people shifting in their seats. Not because Vanessa had become a hero, because everyone suddenly understood Ethan's pattern. Different lies. Same victim. Susan asked permission to play one final recording. The judge agreed. Ethan's own voice filled the courtroom. Clear, calm, confident. Once the house closes, everything else gets easier. Another voice, Vanessa's. What about Claire? Ethan laughed. She signs whatever I put in front of her. The recording stopped. Nobody spoke. Not even Ethan. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely afraid. The judge called another recess. While everyone filed into the hallway, Harold quietly sat beside me. He hadn't spoken much all day. Finally, he smiled. You doing all right? I think so. You know. He looked toward Lily, sleeping peacefully in Mom's arms. I've sat through hundreds of board meetings. This is much more stressful, I laughed. I thought wealthy executives didn't get nervous. Oh, Claire, he grinned. We're professionals. We simply pretend better. That little joke somehow loosened the knot in my chest. When court resumed, Ethan's attorney surprised everyone. He requested additional time to review newly submitted evidence. Susan objected. The judge denied the request. The evidence was properly disclosed. Then he turned toward Ethan. Mr. Whitmore, you remain under oath. The judge asked several questions himself. Simple ones, direct ones. Where did the sale proceeds go? Why were signatures inconsistent? Why did multiple accounts receive identical transfers? Ethan answered fewer and fewer. Several times he simply said, on advice of counsel. Eventually the judge nodded. I understand. He understood more than Ethan realized. Near the end of the hearing, the judge looked toward Susan. Does your client wish to make a statement? Susan turned to me. Only once, no words, just a small nod. I stood slowly. Every eye in the courtroom followed me. I looked at Ethan, then at Lily sleeping against my mother's shoulder. For months, I'd imagined this moment. I'd rehearsed angry speeches in my head, thought about exposing every lie. Instead, none of that seemed important anymore. I took one steady breath. The day our daughter was born, I paused. You believed I'd lost everything. I looked at Lily again. The truth is, she was the only thing worth keeping. I let the silence settle before finishing. Everything else was replaceable. No applause, no dramatic gasps, just quiet, the kind that fills a room when everyone already knows what the right outcome should be. The judge adjusted his glasses and began reading his findings. He ruled that substantial evidence supported Claire's claims of fraud, forgery, and financial misconduct. He authorized broad financial discovery, issued orders preserving the remaining disputed assets, and referred key evidence to the appropriate criminal authorities for further investigation. Ethan remained motionless. The confidence he'd carried into the courtroom had disappeared. When the hearing ended, 2 investigators waiting outside approached his attorney and quietly asked to speak with him regarding the ongoing fraud investigation. I didn't stay to watch. There was nothing left to prove. As we walked toward the parking lot, Mom gently rocked Lily, who had just woken from her nap. Harold caught up beside me. So, he asked with a smile, how about we celebrate? I laughed. With champagne? He looked horrified. Young lady. He glanced at Lily. I was thinking pancakes. For the first time in months, the future sounded sweeter than the past. People sometimes assume that once you win in court, life suddenly becomes easy again. It doesn't. Court orders don't tuck a baby into bed, they don't heal betrayal, they don't erase the habit of reaching for a phone before remembering there's nobody left to call. Real life keeps moving. So do you. By the following spring, Lily was sitting up by herself and trying to crawl across my mother's living room rug. Every morning she'd make a determined little grunt, scoot forward 2 inches, then roll onto her back looking offended that gravity existed. Mom and I would clap anyway. "That's my granddaughter," she'd laugh, too stubborn to quit. I smiled every time she said it. Maybe Lily got that from both sides of the family, but she'd only keep the good parts. The legal process stretched on for months. The divorce itself was finalized first. Then came the financial settlements. Richard and Susan had warned me not to expect miracles. They were right. Some of the money was gone forever. Ethan had burned through enormous sums trying to hide old investment losses, long before I ever discovered what he was doing. Still, the court ordered substantial restitution from the remaining assets. Insurance recovered part of our retirement savings because of the documented fraud. Several frozen accounts were eventually released to me. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to rent a small townhouse in Fishers only 15 minutes from the hospital where I'd worked for years. The first night Lily and I slept there, the place echoed. No pictures on the walls, no dining room table, just borrowed furniture, a crib, and 2 folding lawn chairs in the living room. Mom looked around and smiled. "You know what?" "What?" "It already feels more peaceful than that big house ever did." She was right. Home had never been about square footage. I'd simply forgotten that for a while. Ethan's life moved in the opposite direction. State regulators suspended his financial licenses. Several former clients filed civil lawsuits after learning about the investigation. The county prosecutor eventually charged him with multiple counts related to fraud and forgery. I wasn't in the courtroom when the criminal case began. I didn't want to be. Susan called afterward. He accepted responsibility for some of the charges as part of a plea agreement. I closed my eyes. How long? "There will be sentencing later." I thanked her and hung up. Then I went back to spoon-feeding mashed sweet potatoes to Lily. Strangely enough, that felt far more important. Vanessa wrote me a letter, not an email, an actual handwritten letter. It arrived about 3 weeks after the divorce became final. I almost threw it away without opening it. Instead, I made coffee, sat on the back porch, and read every word. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't deserve to. She simply admitted she'd ignored warning signs because she'd wanted to believe Ethan's promises. She'd sold her condominium to invest with him, lost nearly everything. She was rebuilding her own life by working full-time again and helping investigators whenever they asked. The last paragraph stayed with me. "I can't undo what I helped happen to you. I just hope one day your daughter grows up believing there are more honest people than dishonest ones." I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Not because I'd forgiven her, because carrying anger forever would have meant Ethan stole something else from me. I wasn't willing to give him that. Harold became a regular part of our lives. Every Sunday afternoon he'd arrive in the same old pickup truck he'd insisted on buying after retiring for real. His security team hated it. He loved it. One afternoon, I asked why he didn't drive one of his luxury cars anymore. He grinned. "This truck fits into grocery store parking spaces." Fair point. He'd spread a blanket across my tiny backyard and spend hours making ridiculous animal noises while Lily laughed so hard she'd hiccup. He wasn't trying to replace the grandfather she'd never know. He was simply being himself. That turned out to be more than enough. One Sunday, he showed up carrying a small blue folder. "I have something for you." "If it's money, I'm giving it back." He laughed. "I knew you'd say that." Inside was paperwork establishing an education trust for Lily. The funds couldn't be touched until she reached college age. My eyes immediately filled with tears. "Harold, it's not charity." He gently closed the folder. "It's something Margaret and I wanted to do for children long before she passed away. You just happened to remind me not to stop believing in people." I hugged him before I could think twice. He awkwardly patted my shoulder. "I've never been very good at hugs." I noticed. That summer, I returned to work part-time in labor and delivery. Walking back into the hospital felt strange. The nurses gathered around Lily's stroller during my first visit. There were hugs, homemade cookies, far too many balloons. My friend Denise looked at me and said exactly what I'd needed to hear. You know... What? You don't look like someone who lost everything. I thought about that while changing into my scrubs. She was right, I hadn't. I'd lost a marriage built on lies. I'd lost a beautiful house. I'd lost money. But I'd found out who would still stand beside me when all of that disappeared. Mom, Susan, Richard, Harold. Old friends who quietly showed up with casseroles and diapers without asking questions. Those people became the foundation Ethan could never take. About a year after I first arrived at my mother's house carrying Lily, we drove past my old neighborhood on the way home from a birthday party. The white colonial was still there. Fresh landscaping, new shutters, children's bicycles leaning against the garage. A young family had made it their own. Lily pointed through the car window. House! I smiled. It is. She had no idea she'd been born there, and she didn't need to. That chapter belonged to me, not to her. I kept driving, without slowing down, without wondering what might have been, without hurting. Looking back now, I don't think buying that bus ticket changed my life because Harold was wealthy. I think it changed my life because it reminded me who I wanted to be at the exact moment I had every excuse to become bitter. Ethan believed the world belonged to people who lied, manipulated, and took whatever they could. He was wrong. In the end, he lost far more than a lawsuit. He lost the chance to watch his daughter grow up surrounded by honesty, laughter, and people who loved each other without conditions. As for me, I finally understood something my father used to say. A house gives you shelter. The people inside it make it a home. It took losing one to find the other. If you've ever had to rebuild your life after someone betrayed your trust, I hope you never forget that healing doesn't happen all at once. It comes one honest day at a time. Thank you for spending part of your day with me, and I hope tomorrow brings you something worth smiling about.